We have 10 minutes for questions and hopefully answers, or surely answers. Please. Oliver.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Since there was not such a... Thank you very much. Since there was not such a great diversity of opinion on Iran on the panel, let me maybe try to add a little bit of spice to the discussion. I don't know if that's the role that Emily assigned to me, but I'm going to do that nevertheless. I think I want to make one fundamental point and then pick up two smaller issues. I could pick up many more, but let me pick up two. I think the fundamental point I'd like to make is that the fundamental decision that has to be made is, can we impose permanent limits on Iran's nuclear capabilities? We can have discussions about whether the details of this deal are good enough or not good enough, but I think at the end of the day, the only alternative would be to have permanent limits on Iran's nuclear capability to fulfill the requirements that seem to be guiding the presentations. And I think that's not in the cards. It's not in the cards, legally speaking. None of the UN Security Council resolutions speak about permanent limits, but only about suspension of Iran's nuclear capabilities. And it's also not in the cards politically, and it hasn't been in the cards since, I think, 2005, when the Bush administration embraced the European approach to look for a diplomatic solution and define such a solution in a way that you rebuild confidence in the peaceful intentions of Iran. So that being said, I do think there are permanent restrictions built into a possible deal from everything that we know, and I'm sure there's many things that we all don't know about what may be in the cards. No reprocessing. The heavy water reactor in Iraq will be converted. Iran will ratify the additional protocol from all we know. And I recall about a year and a half ago, I think Ephraim Eskolai was in Berlin, and we had a discussion on the requirements on a deal. And many of these issues were still on the table, and they were top requirements, and they have been maybe not resolved, but they are no longer as important as they were a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, maybe.
Oliver, can we respond to your
yeah, sure.
Because
sure.
You made a great point.
Yeah.
And we hear it a lot in Washington.
Can I just go through my other points? Then I'd be very interested in your response. And the final permanent restriction, of course, is the NPT. And we heard David Sanger yesterday talking about Iran being in a different category than North Korea, for example, which doesn't care about its international reputation and isolation internationally, and Iran obviously does. So that is my fundamental point. The two detailed points I want to pick out: zero breakout time. I don't think that's correct. Even for non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, there's no assumption that non-nuclear weapon states have a zero breakout time and are ready to go nuclear without any warning. There are verification requirements under safeguards and so on. And clearly, if there were indications of continued weapons research, this would trigger an international reaction. So I do think you can say that breakout time is not long enough, but you certainly cannot say that there's zero breakout time. Secondary sanctions and transatlantic unity, which of course are coming from Berlin and Europe, is a very important topic. Indeed, I think secondary sanctions are a contentious issue, and they're driving Europe and the United States apart. But I do not think it's the right approach to say that Europeans simply have to submit themselves to secondary sanctions, and then there will be greater transatlantic unity. It takes two to tango, I think, and these are not only illegal in the EU, and the European courts have declared them illegal. They're illegal under WTO rules. So we have an issue here that needs to be resolved. And I think if we go down this road and every country, including Europeans, were starting to impose secondary sanctions, free trade would be in deep, deep trouble. So I think there's an issue here to resolve. I think at the end of the day, it really boils down to two different takes on a possible deal with Iran. Do we see this in transformational terms, as many in America do, that this deal will have to transform Iran, or do we see it in transactional terms, which I do think most Europeans do tend to do. And we have an experience that even if you view engagement with countries you don't like, and you don't like the nature of the system in transactional terms, in the long term it can lead to transformation, political transformation. That's our experience during the Cold War. But I think there is a fundamental difference here. So those are the points I wanted to make up to steer a bit of debate, maybe. Thanks very much.
Can I address a couple of them? And
perhaps we'll collect some other
okay.
questions and
Thank you for the interesting presentation. Of course, I don't want to repeat what I said yesterday.
The mic is
okay.
on?
Yes. My name is Dina Hekel from the Egyptian Embassy, because I would like to explain our position. I don't want to repeat what I said yesterday about the Egyptian and the Arab position vis-a-vis the WMD free zone. But Ambassador Shimon, I was really surprised to hear your description that Egypt lost and Israel won. And I think that as long as Israel refuses to make any significant efforts to show its readiness to be engaged in such efforts, for example, I read also the papers that you wrote with Dr. Emily about how we can achieve a WMD free zone, about let's start with chemical free zone or something. I think we all fail. If we don't have a region free of weapons of mass destruction, we all fail. No one won, no one lost. Thank you.
Other questions?
Okay. Oliver, thank you for the questions, and I'm glad you made your comments, because you're right. We need to spur debate. Number one, the permanency of the agreement. I've not for 1 minute suggested that there should be permanent restrictions on Iran. I began my presentation by saying there are 65 countries, right, that for whom the IAEA has reached a broader conclusion that it's a peaceful program. It is entirely conceivable that Iran could get a broader conclusion that it has a peaceful program in 5 years. They could get it in 7 years. They could get it in 10 years. My point is, I think it is dangerous to give Iran undetectable breakout or near zero breakout before the IAEA says that Iran has a peaceful program. And the construct of the deal, right, anticipates that it's exactly what may happen. So, hang on, sorry, give me 2 seconds. So what I'm suggesting is that Iran should be the 66th country, okay, where the IAEA says it's a peaceful program, there are no clandestine sites, no clandestine activities, no illicit diversion, we've reached a broader conclusion, it's a peaceful program, all the restrictions go away, you're under the NPT, you're a normal nuclear state. But for Iran to get undetectable breakout before the IAEA says it's a peaceful program, I think is a mistake. Number two, zero breakout. We can argue about zero breakout or near zero breakout. What's driven the construct of this deal is the administration's concern that the breakout time was diminishing to a point that it would reach a point where it could be undetectable. And so that the entire construct of this deal is designed around trying to extend breakout time to a year to give sufficient time. So whether it's a week or 2 weeks or a month, we may have disagreements. But clearly the administration is very worried about the situation where there is a undetectable breakout in a declared facility. Number three, the issue of secondary sanctions. We are in full agreement. What we don't want to do is be in a position where the United States in 5-10 years is imposing secondary sanctions on the Europeans. I wrote a paper recommending that instead of suspending sanctions and snapping them back, we should defend the sanctions regime against its precipitous unraveling. There is a smart way to do sanctions relief, and I think the snapback sanction creates the secondary problem you're talking about. And finally, I agree with you, transactional, because I think the notion that we will transform this regime in 10 to 15 years from a regime that is no longer this regime and is a regime that can be trusted with a nuclear program of industrial size and zero breakout is a delusion. So we need a transactional deal, and my recommendation for a transactional deal would be a deal that was actually tied to whether Iran has made a strategic decision to have a peaceful program. And if it hasn't, it shouldn't get all these restrictions lifted. And if it has, it should get them lifted sooner than 10 years. or perhaps longer than 10 years. But that has to be the key verification criterion for this deal, not whether Iran has essentially given us a year breakout time and dismantled nothing.
If I may, the problem with all these offers which connected the transformation of the regime with the future change of the sanctions and so on and so forth, which does not connect them, is that maybe you are right. And we should be very optimistic, and that will happen in the future, and Iran will be different Iran. But there is a slight option that you are wrong. And Iran will not change. And we will find the same Iran, much stronger economically, with billions of dollar investments from all around the world, which will not allow to put the sanctions back. And it's not just the Europeans, others will be against sanctions. It will not be so easy, even for the Americans, if they invest in companies investing in Iran will be, I don't know, numbers that the American market cannot give up. And we will find the same Iran, even more dangerous because of the new generation of leaders, which might be even more extremist than the present one. Stronger Iran with no sanctions. So this is a risk that Europe can take. Israel cannot take. And we cannot agree to any agreement which might bring us, or even if it is only 20% chance, to a situation in which we will meet at the end stronger Iran with nuclear capability. And the chances to have sanctions is very, very minor. And I think that if I look at the world at the last 10 years and Iran at the last 20 years, what are the chances that it will be an optimistic outcome like you described or a pessimistic one? I think that the pessimistic scenario have more base on the ground. And this is why I, from the Israeli point of view, not from the European point of view, not from the American point of view, this is a risk that we cannot take, with all due respect to the optimistic argument. We know about some countries which had been engaged by the West and restarted their relations with and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, they didn't change. Some of them, you know, because it's in your area, it's very near to Europe. Some of them are far away from Europe. So, you know, you cannot ignore the Middle East in the last 30 years and to build something which is very much related to the history of Europe in the last 50 years and not connected at all to the history of the Middle East in the last 50 years. This is why, with all due respect to the good mood and dreams of so many people about the world, that the engagement with the Iranians will change for the better the Iranian regime, I think that we don't have any real ability to connect it to the realities on Iran or in the Middle East.
Additional questions?
Well.
Shimon, don't forget Shimon, my friend.
Why should? I guess you don't want to suggest that Egypt left the conference with flying colors, do you? And if that's the case, then I happen to disagree with you. I think
no, we are very glad about it.
Yeah, well, therefore I said that we consider ourselves as, in a way, winner, because it's a long struggle. And yeah, I know, but that's exactly the problem. I wish we could have a more detailed discussion on the Egyptian and Israeli fundamental, which I said, ideological differences concerning how do we proceed in terms of regional security and arms control. And those differences have been with us since the beginning of the Acres process, beginning of the 90s. So, I mean, it's a kind of a continuation. And as long as Egypt doesn't change its zero-sum mentality, that is to say, I mean, there is only the Israeli nuclear and there's nothing else, then we will be stuck. And I think that Ambassador Layava, recognizing the difficulties, was trying to bridge and find a way, and he was unsuccessful. And you have to ask ourselves, why was he unsuccessful? And how could he be successful, he or somebody else, if they will take another attempt to launch a process? And I think that what you want is simply not in the cards. So, and what we want is not in the cards for you. So we have to find a different way of approaching it, given also the realities on the ground, which you sometimes happen to disregard.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation by all the participants, and thank you, the audience, for your questions and attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much.